This piece of advice, I want people to hear more. This applies to technologists and to biologists. Do not mistake innovation for a product. Just because it's a really cool technology or a really cool algorithm or a really cool biological discovery that you made, that doesn't mean that it's a product.
There's a lot of this scientific innovation that is out there, but how much of that is actually making it into patient care, making it into the bedside?
One of the things that technology has always done is it really democratizes the access to expertise, and that's what's going to happen here. I think capturing clinician-patient interactions is such an interesting place to be. You're not necessarily collecting the primary thing, but the way humans behave in response to that thing is what you're capturing, and I think there's going to be a lot of value in that.
Everyone agrees that AI is going to change how we discover new cancer treatments. But the question is, what does a messy middle look like? And what foundations need to be set for us to get there? Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Alicia Zhou, the CEO of the Cancer Research Institute. We discuss what the toolkit of a bench scientist in the future actually looks like, and whether fully automated discovery is even on the horizon. Then we get into novel data sources, such as where ambient AI may fit in. What could clinician-patient conversations tell us about variances in patient outcomes? We wrap up with the adoption problem and what it takes to build AI tools that both researchers and clinicians will actually use. Let's get into it. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks. So one of the things that we talked about before, this recording, what you think the value of having kind of like this real world ambient data is. DeepScribe, we're doing hundreds of thousands of, cancer visits every single month, and we're recording, these words that these doctors are saying and these patients are saying to each other that really give kind of a new perspective on, what's happening and how the care is actually being administered. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what value do you see in that data? And do you think that this could be another dimension that could be useful when you're doing, or, for the discovery engine, or if you're just doing basic scientific discovery?
Yeah, I think capturing clinician-patient interactions is such an interesting place to be. As healthcare evolves, ultimately, in order to take care of your body, you do need to have a physical interaction with that clinician, and certainly having an interaction, building a relationship with that clinician. The clinician is going to become ever more powered by different tools and data sets. The patient will also become powered with even more data and tools. And so the question then is, what happens to this interaction? I think that the interaction itself is incredibly powerful because at the end of the day, there's a trust that's built between the clinician and the patient during that interaction. And if there is trust, then there is compliance. And I think one of the big things that we don't think a lot about is human behavior is very non-compliant. Your average human deviates from protocol all the time. And so we like to predict outcomes, but the outcome is usually based off of 100% compliance, where you're like, I told you to do the thing, and you've actually done the thing. And when it comes to things like cancer treatment, there are so many variables that come to play, right? In terms of you're supposed to go and get these infusions done, and you have to be on time to your appointments, and you actually have to show up for all of them. And then the on the other side, the clinician who's delivering the therapy has to actually do it correctly, right? There's all these places where things could possibly go wrong, and it creates variance then in terms of the way the care is delivered. You actually are able to capture a lot of interesting things through a conversation between clinician and a patient. I think the other piece of this that you're capturing that is otherwise uncaptured is sort of the general behavioral mental state of the patient. All of this we know actually influences outcomes. There are plenty of studies that show that if you are optimistic during cancer treatment, you're likely to have better outcomes than if you're really pessimistic during cancer treatment. And is it truly just a psychosomatic thing where it's your mental state actually changing your outcomes? Maybe, but it's also potentially because if you're optimistic, you're being really compliant, you're doing all the things, and if you're pessimistic, you're like, I don't care, and you're only doing half of the things. So it's really interesting. I think that you're going to capture something that's hard to quantify right now in terms of exactly how that's going to turn into differences in patient outcomes, but I'm sure that there is something in there that will be predictive, and that's really interesting. It reminds me actually of there's this product that Google came out with out of Google.org like 20 years ago. It's called Flu Trends, and it was able to predict where there was a flu outbreak in the United States simply by studying the search terms of users in certain geographies. And it actually got so good that it could predict an outbreak of the flu before the CDC knew that there was an outbreak of the flu, simply based off of the search terms people were using in certain geographies. You were like, oh, there's definitely a flu outbreak there because everybody's Googling for the same thing. You're going to have a similar effect where you're not necessarily collecting the primary thing, but the way humans behave in response to that thing is what you're capturing. And I think there's going to be a lot of value in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think like a lot of the data, like you said, that exists is really like a lagging indicator of what actually happens. Whereas you can really start to think about these conversations and the things that you could pick up from these conversations as signals or leading indicators of what might actually happen, whether or not a patient will be compliant based off of their sentiment, similar to like predicting the flu. It's like rather than waiting for all these patients to come up with the flu and the doctor puts it in the EHR and then it sends it to somebody 3 months later to review and say, oh, like now there's a flu outbreak 3 months ago.
Yeah.
You're able to say, wow, these people are searching for this stuff. They must mean they have the flu.
Yeah.
It's interesting how like that plays into the scientific discovery, because I think trying to understand how the body reacts in the context of this variance is almost like as important as just like the basic science itself, right? Like I think a lot of technologists assume that we live in this perfect world. It's like Econ 101. It's like just perfect competition and, everyone has full access to information. And it's just like in healthcare, that's simply not the case.
Yeah.
Right. It's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about here. And, we never really haven't spent as much time thinking about how the ambient data applies to the actual scientific discovery part. It's more just about the administrative part of how can we better, improve the administration of care. And so, I think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the other thing to think about here is at some point, these data sets are all going to need to talk to each other, right? And so it's interesting to think now about how you would do that. I just think right now where we are is that there's this massive adoption / expansion of data to be captured. One of the things that I think is a problem that is worth thinking about, just anticipating where the field is going, is at some point what's going to happen is you're going to end up with this massive explosion of point solutions for different parts of the care continuum. And if you're the patient or you're the clinician, you're going to be like, I have 24 apps or solutions that I subscribe to or am using in order to solve these different use cases that I have. The ability to be interoperable with other players in the same continuum of care will then become a real feature, because at the end of the day, the user, the clinician or the patient, doesn't want to have to be switching between all these different contexts and environments. So the ability to sort of be in a platform that you don't ever have to, or an ecosystem that you don't ever have to log out of, or that you can easily switch between, will become a real defining and differentiating feature that will help capture your user in a way that I think, like, there's something to think about now. Like, I'm a very like truly captured Mac user, because the entire Mac ecosystem has me like, by the neck, because I have a MacBook and I have an iPhone and I have a watch, and like now, like all the things, they work automatically with each other and all the data flows between and blah, blah, blah. So now I'm never going to go add another device to my ecosystem that doesn't talk to it. So just thinking about that is like, what is the end user optimizing for as you're building AI tools for healthcare and for patients? Just recognize that, yes, you do have to start with a single use case to start. That is the right way to start. You cannot bite off more than you can chew. But at some point, you do have to understand and think about, how does your tool fit into the broader ecosystem in a way that doesn't create more friction for your user, and that could become a winning proposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that advice is so good because we're starting to see that play out in the market. If I'm being honest with you, I think with the advent of AI and the proliferation of all these new companies that are building these point solutions, a lot of the health systems that previously were competing on their ability to push projects through governance and get projects into the hands of physicians, you're seeing them make a lot of progress in adopting a lot of point solutions, right? And that's awesome because they're able to figure out what works, what doesn't, why things don't work, why things do work. But at the same time, like, I think what you really miss at the end of it is the ultimate vision, which is the ability for all of these point solutions to share the same latent space in terms of the data so that they can share that context with each other. So each part of the workflow is informing the next. And it poses a really interesting kind of thought experiment because, whereas before, the faster you can move, healthcare was notoriously slow, and the faster you can move, it's almost like a badge of honor. But now you're seeing, hey, like, are the health systems that are moving a bit slower and more meticulously, being more thoughtful about, hey, like, let's not just adopt all these point solutions. Let's really figure out what are the core functionalities that we need, where we're not just focusing on the point solution, we're focusing on how do each parts of the value chain inform one another, and how can we work with a vendor to actually build that interoperability. It's a thought experiment, like, which one wins, right? I personally think the value is, to your point, is really this shared latent space of information so that you can have kind of this contextually aware AI co-pilot along every part of the value chain.
Yeah, it's always about when you're building quickly in a very shifting environment. It's all about trying to anticipate where the puck is going to, right? And on this, I think this is one place where I'm seeing, like, and it's somewhat, I wouldn't say predictable, but like you're watching it play out in terms of, like, this is the natural way that this is going to happen. Is you're going to get many players who all are trying the new technology and applying it to different specific use cases. There's always this need to differentiate your particular product from others that are in this space, and then there's this feeling of we need to outcompete products that are similar to ours. The one thing that you should just think about here is, like, at the end of the day, you have to ask, are you in the pre-competitive part of the space, or are you in the truly competitive part of the space? And the reality is that AI, I think, is a place where it's still pre-competitive. And what that means then is actually the win of any AI solution is actually a win for all AI solutions. And by that same token, the loss of any AI solution, the negative headline that is made by any AI solution dramatically negatively affects the entire space. And so this is the time actually to start to recognize it's actually your responsibility, not just to build a really good product, but also to ensure that other people are building really good products. Because if somebody else builds a really bad product, it hurts you. Because now they're going to be, and this happened to us in the diagnostic space with Theranos, right? Like, everybody is making really great improvements on diagnoses, diagnostics, making them faster, making them cheaper, making them easier for the human to use. It just takes one really bad actor to, like, set the entire space back, where you're like, no, yeah, they were committing fraud. We're not. But, like, it's so hard at that point to talk to investors or to talk to users when you've already had someone that sort of sullied the reputation of the industry already. Similarly, in AI, I think that's the thing, is, like, this is the time you have to be really thoughtful and careful about the product that you're building, but also, like, the space has to figure out very quickly how to, I don't know, like, police itself, but how to create this sort of oath of quality amongst the good players to ensure that then you don't end up with one of these bad eggs out there, because something like that can really set the industry back.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a huge culture shift, right? I think healthcare, especially technology vendors in healthcare, have traditionally been very competitive with each other. The best example is, like, every health technology company trying to integrate with an EHR. It's like the most impossible thing ever, right? But I think you're completely right. It's like, if they have a failed AI implementation, it actually leaves a stain on not just that specific use case or that specific product, but it sets the whole organization back in terms of, hey, like, do we need to, relook at our governance process? Do we need to measure ROI earlier? Do we need to have a longer pilot? And then it ends up just stifling innovation. The point about adoption is so real, right? Like, we saw this in the ambient space. We've been doing ambient documentation for almost 9 years at this point. And with the advent of LLMs, what we've been trying to build for all these years finally actually worked.
Yeah.
But when it worked for us, it worked for hundreds of other people.
Right.
And now, since I started the company, I think we started the company with maybe 1 or 2 competitors. And the last time I checked, I think there's 163 ambient vendors just in the US. I think one of the big things that we saw was, once this technology worked, the health systems were just so eager to implement these solutions that they were almost just throwing this technology over the fence to the providers and expecting this to work, right? Because, ambient documentation, I think, of all the things in healthcare, from an outside perspective, it's like the easiest thing to understand, right? You don't need to be a doctor to understand that eliminating, documentation or automating documentation is going to be a huge win. And so a lot of these team members that are implementing this technology at the health systems, they were like, oh, like, of course this is going to work. People are going to love it. And what we ended up kind of running into was there's this huge gap in adoption, right? There's one thing to build technology, and there's another thing to actually implement it in healthcare.
Yep.
And we started seeing this kind of big opportunity, if you will, for us to really focus on adoption, because we saw a lot of the other ambient companies, they were, being able to sign these really big contracts, but they're not able to get extremely high levels of adoption for every single note that the doctor is using. They're recording this conversation. And I think it plays out for not just ambient, but it's a good case study for every other AI solution that's going to be built. I'm bringing this back to your question. With the discovery engine, right? Ultimately, you guys are going to build products, or people are going to build products with this, right? And you said yourself that one of the things that you imagine is this kind of co-pilot for these bench scientists.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you think about adoption, right? Like, how do you think about getting tools like that into the hands of people so that they're actually useful, rather than saying, hey, we just built this cool technology, create a cool demo video out of it?
One of the things that technology has always done over and over again is it really democratizes the access to expertise or what we feel like is very specific know-how. And that's what's going to happen here. And I think what you're going to see is that this kind of a tool will democratize the way that people can do biology research, not just at academic institutions, but probably sort of from your own computer, right? Like, you're going to have a lot of these like armchair scientists. And that's going to be really interesting. And I think that's the thing when you think about adoption, is there's sort of tops down versus bottoms up. And one of the things that is that in certain ways, yes, tops down gets you immediate access to a very large TAM. But if nobody likes the product or it's not useful, ultimately, no one's going to use it. Even if like the like head of the institute is like, we have this tool, everyone should use it, I'm going to purchase an enterprise license for everybody. You're going to have a bunch of people where they're like, cool, and like never open it. And so I do think it's actually really about both understanding the bottoms up adoption as well as the tops down. And that's where then when you're building a product or a solution, you want to be thinking about how you're solving for both of those types of users. You want to be solving for the grassroots person who's saying like, I just really want a tool that's going to like make my life easier, more efficient. I want to waste less time. I want to make more impact with fewer resources. And I want it to be right. I want it to be useful. And this is the thing about healthcare in general, is that it's a different stakes game you're playing in this space than in like, writing an email, right? Like if you generated an email and it wasn't very good, like, someone's going to be like, yeah, I don't like it.
Stakes are a lot lower.
Right. The stakes are a lot lower. And so you really do have to think about how are you immediately adding value to your end user, who's your grassroots user, but then how are you also adding value at the ecosystem level for your tops down user. And so I think you have to think about both. I do think that in general, the world is preparing itself for understanding, even making sense of all of the different AI solutions that are going to come to market for every single part of our life, right? Like you're going to use AI at work as a professional, and then you're going to have a bunch of AI tools that you're using as just like a hobbyist and a consumer. And I think that is going to really, we're going to learn a lot about human behavior around AI over the next, let's call it 3 years. Along the way, I think you have to be ready to adopt and adapt your product to those trends. So it's almost hard to predict today. I don't know, but I do think what I do know is that 5 years from now, people will have a very different fluency and sentiment towards this technology stack than what they have today. And knowing that, and because I'm building something for the next 5 years, I have to be able to adapt my plan on how I build it to how that changes.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And I think the mistake that a lot of technologists make is that they assume that everyone's a builder.
Yeah.
But the majority of the world, I mean, it's hard to believe when you live in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But
the majority of the world doesn't like to exactly. They just want to use it.
Yeah. And I think the real opportunity is it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is how can you be really use case specific, right? We found a lot of success, in doing that. We noticed that oncology was a super unique in terms of how they write their documentation. We built a product that was bespoke to oncology, and, we were able to get 85% adoption versus, I think the last class report in oncology adoption for ambient was 13%, right? And so I think that it's just an interesting case study of where these AI tools are today is, everyone's just tinkering, right? Figuring out what works, right? OpenClaw is one of the biggest kind of news things to hit, and everyone is playing with OpenClaws. Everyone's figuring out how to build personal agents. But at the end of the day, my mom isn't going to set up her own OpenClaw, but she will definitely benefit from it, right? And it's who is going to be the one that builds, has my mom as their, ICP, their ideal customer profile, has her persona, and was I'm going to build a product especially for them. This technology is amazing, right? It really gives a brand new opportunity for builders. But at the end of the day, you have to bend the technology to the user for it to actually drive adoption. I think that's a thing that we're still figuring out as an industry today.
Yeah, actually, this is one thing this piece of advice I want people to hear more, which is that, and this applies to technologists and to biologists, do not mistake innovation for a product. Those two are not the same thing. Just because it's a really cool technology or a really cool algorithm or a really cool biological discovery that you made, that you just as a expert, you're can you believe we did this? Holy moly! This is paradigm shifting for the field. Yes, and that doesn't mean that it's a product. That doesn't mean you should make that into a product. It doesn't mean that you should spin out a company. It doesn't mean, right? It doesn't mean any of those things. Product market fit is a different thing. And you have to have humility about the coolness of your innovation versus the utility of that innovation to drive a product that people should actually use. And if we could be more focused and disciplined about this, I think you would see a lot more efficient products and company formation and products. And I think we would hopefully be able to tamper down some of the noise that consumers currently feel about AI, which is there's just too much noise and I don't want to think about it. And it's actually on us to be able to do that for ourselves, self-regulate for ourselves. Because if we don't, then we create just a bunch of noise that the consumer doesn't want. So that's one thing I think is really important.
It's almost when I went to school at Berkeley, there were so many people that were just in academia, right? And I think back to something that Deborah Pat said on this podcast was we have the Ferraris of medicine. We just don't have the roads to drive them on.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of this scientific innovation that is out there, but how much of that is actually making it into patient care, making it into the bedside? And there's so much to do there that, you can argue like, hey, like, is it better worth our time to spend on taking the existing innovations and figuring out how to actually drive adoption to them? Or is it better worth our time to just, discover more innovation? And it's, I'd be curious to get your take, as the CEO of CRI, looking at all these research proposals, thinking about what to fund. How does that kind of mental model play into, your remit at CRI and thinking about what, innovation is actually important to fund?
Yeah. I love that analogy. I'm definitely stealing it. Here's how I think about it. From a scientific funding standpoint, sort of the research projects that we fund, our goal is to fund Ferraris. Our goal is to find that leading edge of innovation where I don't have to care right now about the feasibility of adoption. I just want to see truly pushing the limits of knowledge when it comes to these biological insights. On the other hand, what do I think CRI should be building? We should be building the roads. So we are funding projects that are for Ferraris, and then what we are building is we are building roads. Because the reality is that is what nonprofits should do. We are at an interesting intersection of, we do not need to create commercial upside and think about long-term, revenue return to our investors, right? We're a nonprofit, and we don't have to think about making sure we're publishing in the best journals and winning a Nobel Prize one day because we're not academia. What we can afford to do is we can spend our time building the unsexy infrastructure that's going to be necessary for both of those two parties to thrive. And so that's the way I think about it is, we should be funding research that is towards truly breakthrough. And we should be building infrastructure that is just like plumbing, for all of this. And it will be super useful, but certainly not sexy enough for any academic or for-profit entity to do, which is why a nonprofit should do it.
Yeah, and I love that because it's so important, right? Like, it's like, think about like the highway system in America, right? And how that gave the remit for entire industrial revolution of America. Yeah. And it's just like, it's such a, I think you have a really fun job to think about that because you don't have the constraints that, I do or a health system does, or, I'm really glad that you're in the driver's seat there, pushing that innovation forward.
Thank you. Yes, I love it too.
All right, Alicia, I know we're like over time already. I appreciate all the time that you've given us thus far. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was so much fun.